Hi everyone, my name is Randy Bell. I'm the director of the Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. It is such a pleasure to be launching this paper, Ready for Takeoff, today. This paper came out of a partnership that we've developed with Etihad over the past couple of years at this forum, where Linden Coppell right here took us to the biofuels facility that is going to be discussed today, among other things. I think I saw it for the first time about this time last year. And we talked about how we really should be doing some work on the future of biofuels and particularly aviation biofuels to try to advance the industry and find ways that the civil aviation industry can decarbonize. So fast forward a year, and we have this this great paper that David Hitchcock wrote in partnership with the MoUs group, and we were just really happy with our partnership with Etihad, who are the official carrier for the Global Energy Forum. Many of you might have flown them to get here. It was a lovely experience, I'm sure. And so it's just really fantastic to work with such a great partner here in Abu Dhabi. So thank you so much, Linden and the entire Etihad team. And I suspect a couple more people will trickle in over the next few minutes, so be prepared for that. But then over to you, David.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to send that one over there. Welcome, everyone. Really honored and excited to be here. I want to thank the Atlantic Council, the MoUs group, and our gracious hosts and sponsors for putting this together. I won't bore you with my bio or any kind of introduction. It's in the materials. I'll just tell you that I did spend a great portion of my life in the military as a pilot, and I built up an enormous personal carbon footprint. And since then, I've been working at a bunch of clean tech companies trying to make amends for that, so it really it is something I'm passionate about, and I really enjoyed preparing this report. When we started writing this, we realized that it's been 10 years since the first commercial flight on biofuels, and since that first flight, there's been a lot of progress. There's been many fuels that have been certified for use in aviation, certified pathways they call them. There's been scores of demonstration flights. I think Etihad is maybe Lenny can speak to some of the work they're doing there to fly some flights on biofuels as well. And really, frankly, tens of thousands of flights now use biofuels, or could use biofuels if you were theoretically, since they've been introduced into the refueling infrastructure at LAX and some European airports as well. So a lot of confidence, a lot of progress, but they really haven't scaled, and that's kind of what you'll find when you take a look at the document. There is that we kind of talk about the challenges they face to scale and what their prospects are over the next decade. I think we'll hear more about that here from the panel. But I'm personally optimistic. I think the big reason is there's not a lot of alternatives to decarbonize or reduce the carbon footprint of aviation without biofuels. Liquid energy is going to be required to provide the the heavyweight long haul transportation that you're looking for. There's not a lot of other options, and so I do think that there it kind of forces this, as well as, and we'll hear about this more, the recent or the soon to be implemented new scheme, CORSIA, by the International Civil Aviation Organization. It's a program to help them achieve their goal of carbon neutral growth after 2020. And on January 1st, everyone began tracking their carbon footprint. All the aviation companies, all the airlines, so that they could set that baseline on December 31st, I guess, 2020 or whatever. That's when they'll set it. So that'll be interesting to see how that gets implemented and what effect that has on this industry. So these are some of the questions the paper attempted to answer, and that we can certainly get into here with this outstanding panel we have here today. Let me just briefly introduce the panelists, and then we'll get started. On my immediate left, we have Dr. Jennifer Holmgren, She has a distinguished career both in the petrochemical world and in the renewables. More recently, like me, I guess she's working off. She's making amends a little bit. She's the CEO of LanzaTech, which is a revolutionary carbon recycling company, and she's been around and done a lot of the groundbreaking work on aviation biofuels, and we can touch on some of that. Next to her is Ms. Linden Coppell. She's the head of sustainability for Etihad Airlines. She has deep experience in sustainability and corporate social responsibility initiatives. I know she worked closely with the International Air Transport Association, and I know she's intimately familiar with CORSIA and its implementation as that program comes online. And then at the far end we have Jeff Skeer. He's a senior program officer with the International Renewable Energy Agency. Some of you may know that as IRENA. He also has a distinguished career in public service with the U.S. Department of Energy, and has really, looking at your bio, Jeff, you touched on a lot of energy technologies, not just biofuels or renewables, but you have a very deep perspective across all types of energy. But in his current role at ARENA, he is assessing the potential of various bioenergy technologies. So certainly do have the experts here. I'll start off here with a few questions, and then we're glad to open it to audience participation early and often. So go ahead and raise your hand if something sounds interesting or you want to hear more. Don't be bashful. We won't mind if you interrupt. So Jennifer, starting with you. Sustainable aviation fuel development faces dual challenges of both proximity and scale. Could you provide your thoughts on how waste to liquid energy technologies like those used by LanzaTech and others can begin to address these challenges?
Thank you for that. So from my perspective, one of the key issues with conventional biofuels, as you well know, is the potential land issues, right? And the ability to grow enough feedstock to power aviation and others. One of the things that waste allows you to do is to use carbon that's already been used before, whether it be as a waste gas, like what we do at LanzaTech, or municipal solid waste, or biomass. You're using carbon that's already had a first purpose, and you're using it for a second purpose. So you're not growing it on purpose. You're not utilizing land. You're not utilizing water. You're not utilizing any fertilizer or anything else. So I think the waste resources are an important way to get away from the issues that first generation biofuels had. The other issue that I think is super important is there's a whole heck of a lot of carbon waste out there. If you start to leverage waste, woody waste, waste biomass, waste MSW, or the industrial gases, we calculated in our technology that you could make 30 billion gallons of ethanol if you just use waste steel gases. There's a lot of carbon out there, so we can start now to make an impact. Petroleum, 50 billion barrels of fuel a day, right? So you've got to have some real impact. You've got to use a lot of carbon.
Great, thank you. Jeff, if I could go to you, would you, the big thing we see is like right now, SAF, there's only about 2%, or by all biofuels, including SAF, only have about 2% penetration in the global liquid fuels market. And that leaves plenty of room, right? There's room for expansion. But one of the things that we just touched on here with the waste is this idea of feedstock availability and in a sustainable manner. So I'm wondering, from your view, what feedstocks have the best potential to scale and why?
Well, certainly, David, you've hit on the right issue, because when you're talking about mature conversion technologies, the feedstock costs can be about 80% of the overall cost. So we really need to focus on which feedstocks are cheapest and most abundant. And I think there's a lot out there, like Jennifer said, not just from the carbon waste streams and woody waste streams, but also even from energy crops. There's a lot of interesting developments. in carbohydrate crops recently. As you know, and the technology for producing ethanol conventionally is very mature, but we have now new technology options for lignocellulosic conversion coming on board, and we have a new technology in agricultural technology called energy cane, which has twice as much biomass. And all of this, along with the waste streams that Jennifer highlights, can be converted to ethanol, which then becomes a very flexible intermediate option for upgrade to jet fuel, for example. Gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of the different feedstocks. So that's a very exciting option. And sugarcane is already a very high yielding crop in terms of land use. I think that different options are going to be good for different places. Sugarcane doesn't just grow in Brazil, although that's where it's most famous for growing. We just are finishing a study of sugarcane potential in 7 countries of Southern Africa. There's many countries elsewhere in Africa, the Caribbean, and sugar is a low value added crop. If we can help the small farmers and large farmers get a higher value added crop, ethanol, and also produce some heat and power in addition, that's going to work pretty well. We shouldn't entirely neglect the other possibilities. First of all, you've got the woody waste that Jennifer points out. You've got the processing residues from when you produce lumber from the logs. You can't produce flat planks from the entire log, so you have processing residues. A lot of that is going to pulp and paper. With the electronic age, we might be needing less paper, and more of that might be available for using to upgrade to convert to jet fuel through a Fischer-Tropsch process or some other more advanced process coming along. And then you've got the logging residues, which are pretty much, you've got the tops and branches and the trunks, which are pretty much almost all left in the forest because they're only worth about 1/8 as much as the stemwood logs. It's just not worth it to take it out, but you could, there's plenty there. If you get the logistics in place, and they're more or less in place because they have ways of getting the logs out of where they're grown, so they can get the other parts out if they wanted to, and getting the conversion costs down. And then you, of course, especially in the context of this very exciting initiative by Etihad to use an oilseed crop grown in the desert in brackish water while creating wonderful side streams of food products could be an excellent option, which we hadn't really been thinking about. And probably that's what grows here. You can't grow sugarcane here, so you shouldn't try, you know. Of course, palm oil has a very bad reputation, justifiably so. First of all, it's not the best quality stuff to try making fuel from, especially jet fuel. It's high upgrading costs, but you know, it's had this terrible history of destroying rainforests in Indonesia. But it's a very high yielding crop, and in fact, it is used in about half the products in the supermarket. So if you're worried about the environment, you have to worry about more than just energy in these terms. And it's possible to raise palm oil sustainably if you don't grow it in a rainforest. If you grow it on an existing farm, if you get the certification schemes right, it might still be worth considering. Not necessarily for jet fuel as much as for other diesel type fuels. So I think there's a lot of potential. And that's not even talking about the theoretical potential from reducing food waste or raising crop yields. There's a huge yield gap. In Africa, you're getting like 15 or 20% of your potential yields. If you could double or triple the yields, you need a lot less land to grow your food, and you can use agroforestry with nitrogen-fixing wood crops to help you get the higher yields and help you, I would say, liberate land to grow energy crops. So, long story short, that's a lot of words, but I think a lot of options. There's something for everyone. You know, one of these crop options grows almost everywhere. Then, where nothing is grown, you've got the industrial plants producing carbon dioxide, as Jennifer says. So, we should have plenty of feedstock.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good point you bring up about yield, yield growth, because that is pointed out in the paper that there was this food versus fuel debate in the U.S. around corn, but in fact, corn yields, even though ethanol production rose precipitously, corn yields more than made up for it, and you were still able to do the ethanol production as well as the grain to feed and all that, really without a large impact. Corn prices actually went down, frankly, so which has been difficult for the American farmer. Okay, Linden, legacy biofuels have faced criticism regarding their sustainability claims. Sticking a little bit here with the feedstock side for another question. And recently, the New York Times published a very important article that highlighted the negative environmental impacts of East Asian palm oil production, in part driven by the demand for biodiesel in the U.S. and the EU. And how I know this is important for Etihad and other end users. How do you ensure that these fuels are produced in a sustainable and fraud-free manner?
I think it's probably right to say that aviation was a little later in the game than other forms, certainly ground transport. We had very strict requirements. We didn't want to have to modify our aircraft. We can't have the luxury of some aircraft needing one type of fuel and another needing another. Can you imagine what terrible situations you'd end up in with aircraft not being able to fly to certain places because biofuel wasn't available, etc. So we always said that at the very start that we had to make sure that we looked at a drop-in fuel, and I think this hasn't really helped with the kind of communication side of it, because it's meant that people think that we are using a different fuel, and even internally we had to do a lot of engagement about this. This is sustainable alternative fuels or sustainable aviation fuels. You have to make sure that people realise these were drop-in, they're exactly the same specification as jet fuel. So I think there was a kind of a lot of education needed to happen, and that fact that we kind of joined the game later meant that we learned from the mistakes of others, basically, is the point I'm getting to. We realised that we had to have extremely strict sustainability criteria. As with my previous airline, and this whole carbon issue, became more in the, was communicated, and I think almost overnight the aviation industry suddenly became kind of public enemy number one when it came to carbon emissions and this implication that we weren't doing anything, and we just weren't very good at getting our messages out. I mean, the fact that we've improved our efficiency substantially since the first generation jet fuels, 70% more efficient than first generation. Every new aircraft now is, substantially better than an aircraft it replaces, etc. But all this meant that we knew that we had to get this right. We could not afford to get this wrong. So I think whatever we're looking at now, we have to look at this whole sustainability piece. There are standards out there. For our project here in Abu Dhabi, we were working very closely with the Roundtable on Sustainable Bioenergy. We brought them into the game very early on to ask them, say, what do you think about this project? And as Jeff said, it's all about fitting a feedstock to the environment that we're in. We knew when we started this project, we couldn't look at anything that needed arable land. We didn't have any. We knew that we couldn't look at anything that needed fresh water. There's very limited amounts of fresh water available. So when Masdar Institute, now Khalifa University, and Boeing first came to Etihad with this project where we could basically use seawater. It's a plant that survives in seawater. It's still got its roots in soil. It's still a plant as opposed to a kind of algae or seaweed. And also importantly, integrating the whole food aspect to it as well, the food security. And when it comes to pricing as well, it also meant that, a lot of our facilities around the production of seafood for the market. And it's that waste, salt water, and the nutrients within that feeds our plant on non-arable land. So these are fundamental aspects of that project that are not only making it sustainable, but are making it economically viable. So across the industry, we're very well aware of the sustainability. It's got to be very high on the agenda, and I think here we're addressing it very well with the project that we're involved in.
As a follow-up, can you shed any light? The one thing that CORSIA, and they've got time to do this, but they haven't published the sustainability standards yet for how they're going to count fuel, or what credit. Do you have any insight into the way CORSIA is going to view sustainability and how they're going to give users credit for flying with lower carbon fuels?
Yeah, a lot of CORSIA is the ICAO carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation. So basically, if countries sign up to it under ICAO, then those states, any flights between those two states, we will have to buy carbon offsets to offset any growth above 2020 baseline. So, as I said, we're starting to collect the data now to form that baseline, and then we'll have to start buying the offsets. There's a lot of the requirements are already there. I think what is missing is the standards for the actual offsets themselves. We're not 100% sure which offsets are going to be eligible. What we do know is that they will use the carbon reduction in the life cycle of that as a measure of how much we can use an offset to compensate for use sustainable fuels instead of having to buy an offset. So for example, if it has a 10% lower life cycle of carbon, then you would need 10 tonnes of that to offset 1 tonne of regular fuel. So in terms of what we want, I mean, that was set fairly low, 10% reduction, but like any airline, when we're going out to look at sustainable alternative fuel projects, we're going to want to try and buy fuel that has got a very low carbon footprint, because then it counts more towards our offset requirements. So I think Corsair has been good in its fact it will drive that carbon reduction, because as airlines will be seeking the best either carbon offset or sustainable alternative fuels that have a low carbon value that can we get maximum bang for our buck effectively. We're buying the best alternative fuel that is out there. But I think we can't forget about that sustainable element though, and it's going to be interesting because at the moment it's not really factored in. Like for us, for example, if we can create more value than just the carbon reduction, should we also be able to somehow incorporate that? Like the job creation, we have as Etihad Airways, as a national airline, we've got a mandate to help diversify the non-fuel economy. This will really help that. There's a huge value to be got from that. And then a huge sustainability impacts from a social perspective, especially if this type of system can be replicated. And there's other places where you can't grow any other crops because of freshwater restrictions, many coastal areas around the world. So it's kind of an interesting one in terms of we're very focused on carbon with Corsair, and whilst these fuels will have to meet certain sustainability standards, it's not necessarily built into that whole equation in terms of how much they're worth to the airlines.
That's great. Thank you so much. Jennifer, over the last 10 years, many upstart sustainable fuel producers and projects have not fared very well. And your company, LanzaTech, is a clear exception to this. What do you feel like that you did differently to achieve the success you have? And what lessons, if any, have you learned from the companies and projects that haven't survived?
It's a loaded question, isn't it? I guess I'll combine the learnings as well as what we've done right, because it's always very difficult to distinguish what you've learned from others and what you already knew, right? So let's just use it as a composite. I would say there's a number of things that I think have been important. We're a biotech company, but half of the company is engineers. I think typically companies that start as engineering companies stay that way, and biology companies stay that way. When a biology company tries to scale and put steel in the ground, there's gaps. So I think the ability to bring a diversity of thought, a diversity of people, a diversity of skills is one of the reasons we've been successful. The second reason I think is we started up in May our first commercial plant producing ethanol from steel mill gases. Woohoo, okay, it's a big deal. We had 80,000 data points on field demos and pilots before we tried to build our commercial. We built 4 different demos in 4 different parts of the world to test 4 different types of gases. 2 points always make a line, and that's how you get fooled, because you think you've got enough data to scale, and you don't. So that's, I think, the other thing that's important. And I think the third thing that's important is no shortcuts, okay? Don't get me wrong, we moved quickly. In 13 years, we went from a technology that nobody believed was even feasible to a technology that's efficient and at scale. But we did that without taking shortcuts. A lot of people, a lot of the VCs tend to invest in companies like ours, and they want to exit in a 7 or 8 year period, right? 7 or 8 years is not enough to build a new technology. And you just have to stay strong, and you have to say, I can't do it, I can't use an old reactor and cut out 2 years and hope that that old reactor works, even though the new reactor design is what's going to make this efficient. So those are the 3 lessons: diversity of thought, no shortcuts, and get as much data as you feel comfortable that you need to scale.
Thank you. Jeff, back to you. Just while biofuels have been mandated or encouraged by policies in many countries, sustainable aviation fuels have yet to gain significant traction. In many instances, current regulations force sustainable aviation fuels to compete with renewable diesel and biodiesel, as well as petrojet fuel. In your opinion, how can government regulations be best targeted to support sustainable aviation fuels deployment and use?
Yeah, thank you for that. Very good question. First of all, I direct the audience to your very well-reasoned critique of the details of the regulations in place and exactly why they're putting jet fuel at a disadvantage vis-a-vis fuel for ground vehicles. So I won't even attempt to address that. It's very well addressed in your report. But I think we really need to focus on the long term. We have ICAO is talking about 50% reduction of carbon emissions by 2050, and I think we can think about intellectually 100% reduction by 2100 perhaps. There's a lot of good news because despite the fact that jet fuel is biojet is a very small percentage of the total today, ICAO says that there's enough potential to get 100% by 2050. A key point here is that, first of all, a kind of targeted support is likely to be needed, or could well be needed. We're kind of looking at projected cost ranges, looking at different feedstocks and different technologies, and it's looking like over the longer term, let's say by the 2040s, if you get a large scale, fully scaled, and you have an oil price of $50 to $100 a barrel, and you have a substantial carbon value, all of the feedstock types, oil-based, carbohydrate-based, woody-based, have a pretty good chance of competing. It's just not clear whether they'll make it because it's not clear what the oil price will be. The oil price could be very weak, especially, I'm sure you've discussed this all the time in the Atlantic Council. We have had this wonderful shale oil discovery, which has created a lot of extra supply. We're going to have a lot of electric vehicles coming in, which is going to tend over several decades to weaken demand. So it's not ridiculous to think you can have $50 oil in 2050. I mean, who really knows? Who really knows whether you're going to get a substantial carbon tax in view of the public difficulties of doing that, political difficulties of doing that. On the other hand, if we were to adopt a targeted approach just for aviation fuel, it seems like it should be doable. I think a good approach, since ICAO says about half the lifting has to be done by efficiency and then half the lifting by sustainable aviation fuel, is to have a kind of regulatory approach that gives equal credit to both. And we know that the equipment manufacturers have made enormous strides in terms of reducing the weight of the airplanes, and there's been enormous strides on logistical grounds, big efficiency improvements. They should get full credit for that. So I would suggest something like a regulation based upon declining number of allowable emissions per passenger kilometer or per ton kilometer in the case of freight. That would give equal credit to both. Let's say also that the airline traveler on average is towards the upper end of the income range. So in terms of the tax that might be, the ability to pay this fee is probably greater for that segment perhaps than for the carbon tax probably through the economy. I don't know.
Well, it'll be interesting. One of the things we touched on in the paper is the new regulations in Norway that are coming online, which is the first actual mandate for sustainable aviation fuel. So I think as as that comes, I think it's 2020. Is that right? I believe is when it starts. It's a very small, 0.5%. It doesn't sound like a lot, but things like that do have a way. Mandates work, and they do have a way of. We saw that with the RFS in the U.S., and they do have a way of moving the market. I'll reach out to the audience. Is there any? Do we have any questions out there from anyone who would like to go first? Go ahead, Tom. Go ahead.
Well, full disclosure, Tom Hicks with the MoUs group, so we're part of this report, but I got to take the opportunity to talk to Linden about. I had a terrific flight over on your 787 from DC, 12 hours. I read there's a nice little piece on you and Etihad in there, which is great. But I guess my question for you is, and I'm not sure if maybe you just alluded to, or you said 10% CO2 reduction. Does Etihad have a stated goal, whether in percent in carbon and fuel and millions of gallons, that they're looking for by some certain date? And if not, do you anticipate that happening at some point in the future?
Mm-hmm. Just to clarify, when I mentioned about the 10%, that's the CORSIA requirements for sustainable fuel, the kind of minimum. That's got to be 10%. For us, it's something that, I've been involved in aviation for years, and it's very difficult to get kind of everybody to kind of pin them down to set absolute targets in the industry, because there's lots of different metrics that you can use, and it does complicate things. What I'd like to say really on behalf of more of the broader industry is that we do have a set of goals under IATA. The first one is the 1.5% efficiency improvement per year, which as an industry we're able to meet, and that comes down to the technical and operational improvements. If we talked about replacing an aircraft with a newer counterpart, we're talking, when we replaced the 787 on the Washington route, we saved about 50 tons of fuel just on one route. It's incredible the kind of savings you can make by the introduction of a much newer aircraft. Of course, the downside is that aircraft's still going to be in the air in 20 years' time, then it's not going to be sufficient anymore compared to a newer one. So if you can't invest, then it's a challenge for you. When it comes to the targets, 2020 carbon neutral growth, that's one that, the big airlines, Etihad included, lots of us have been working with IATA. We helped to set the scene really for that CORSIA system. We realised that we had to do something within the industry. We wanted recognition for what we call our basket of measures, which is all the other efforts we're making, and realising that we have to talk a bit more about that. But saying that, okay, we'll set ourselves a 2020 carbon neutral growth target, which was an IATA target. It didn't come from ICAO originally. ICAO actually adopted that. And, I think there's skepticism that the industry is trying to pull back on meeting all these requirements. We instigated that requirement. We knew that we would have to do something. IATA have got a really nice phrase called license to operate, or license to grow. And we've said for a long time, decarbonising is our only option. We have to do it in some shape or form. Whether it's carbon offsets in the medium term, hopefully then, through technology, through the use of alternative fuels and everything else, we don't want to pay for somebody else to reduce their carbon emissions by buying offsets, ideally. But that's a compromise we've made within the industry. We said we will invest outside of our industry, but ideally let us invest within our industry and let us do that. And then of course we have the 2050 target. So as Etihad, I would say no, we don't. We are very, very much committed to those industry targets, which I think is far more important.
Thank you. Anyone else?
You talked about drop-in fuels, which is obviously what you need for biofuel for jet. Question I have is, why are we pushing along the biofuels route at all, rather than going down and forcing the industry to go to power to liquids, where we can use the Fischer-Tropsch process? We've heard from Net Power that they can produce cheap CO2. Yes, it's an expensive process, but isn't the aviation industry the one that can afford to do that and keep the biofuel supply chain for other forms of transportation?
You want to take it? Or?
Yeah, Power to X, right?
Yeah.
I love Power to X, right? My technology is CO2 products, and as soon as we get electrolysis cheap enough, I can go CO2 to CO2 products, no question. But the reality is, we have to be really careful in the process industry, and we have to be really careful when we're dealing with carbon. We need solutions now, so we cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Okay, we need to keep making progress. It takes a long time to get a new technology to be cost competitive and out the door. You're disagreeing with me?
Well,
Yeah, go
you're
ahead.
saying that perfect, then you're actually saying you're letting cost get in the way.
No,
Because
no.
the aviation industry uses the Fischer-Tropsch process or GTL, so there's nothing new. The technology all exists. It's cost.
Yeah, but
we've
wait.
got to be honest.
So you're proposing that they use electrolysis to go from CO2 to CO at the beginning,
CO2,
and also to do water. But look at but there's a difference, and I think, so first of all, I would say, and I'll let you guys answer for yourselves, but I've been making fuel for the aviation industry. These guys have jumped in from the very beginning. The airlines are actually investing in the first drops of fuel to pull the technology along. So they're doing quite a bit more than anybody in the auto sector. So I would not say cost is the only barrier, but power to X is not 10 cents more expensive or requires an investment. We're talking right now 3 orders of magnitude, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by the perfect being the enemy of the good. I guarantee you electrons are going to be free 10 years from now, okay? But they're not free today, continuing to develop the technology, doing other things in parallel, and then, which is biofuels, and then 10 years from now, being ready to capture that, I think is a great solution. And that's what I mean by don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Don't stop doing the biofuels work because you have a vision that 10 to 15 years from now, this will happen. And by the way, we should be super careful about Fischer-Tropsch. My PhD thesis was in Fischer-Tropsch 30 years ago. Fischer-Tropsch has always been the holy grail, okay? And you know, it works in Qatar with natural gas because they're making 250,000 barrels a day of product, of which a tiny amount is jet fuel. So a tiny amount by the relative overall. So I'm just saying, look, let's not fixate on a technology that's been known that works really well. I think the other thing we need to think about is distribution, distributed. You know, one of the things that I find quite intriguing is we measure new technologies by old technology standards. Petroleum is the densest liquid known to man. You can move it around, and therefore you can build massive plants. And then when somebody tries to do new products, we ask them, how are you going to do 200,000 barrels at one site? The answer is you're not. What is wrong with having 10 economically feasible plants that make the equivalent amount and then centralizing the product or the output? So what I would say is we've got to get off the paradigms we're on and jump off the curve and go on to something else. And I'm okay with us thinking Fischer-Tropsch, the old technology with a new feedstock will work fine. I'm not going to say no, but don't stop the progress on new ideas and other things. There's a lot of new biofuel work going on that will matter, and I would say keep your mind open to that. I think
Yeah, I mean, I think you've answered it well, but I think it's worth mentioning just one other project that we're involved in here, which is waste to jet fuel, which is using municipal waste, and we've been engaging with our waste management authority here, and I've been talking to them for years, trying to persuade them to look at something more innovative than just basically waste to energy facility. And in fact, it's because of the cost of energy now here and the use of things like a lot of solar, they're actually realising that this is a better option for them. They actually came back to me and I nearly fell over when they said, yes, actually, we're going to start looking at this as a potential. So they're now very seriously, the government here, looking at diverting 770,000 tonnes a year of municipal solid waste and looking at potential jet fuels. So I think it's looking at what opportunities there are. I think, it's very easy to start, for us, should we be looking at a liquid fuel now? Should we not start looking at next generations? But you're talking, there's still people on a drawing board in Boeing and Airbus designing an aircraft that needs liquid technology. So it's, and that aircraft's then going to be designed, tested, and then, so we've got to think about these liquid fuels, so.
if I may just briefly, you seem to speak somewhat derisively of a focus on cost, and I just say that for me, more as a kind of energy economist, I think cost is very important. If we can find sustainable feedstocks, and what's wrong with using the straw from sugarcane or corn? What's wrong with using wood waste? If you have a cost-effective process, I don't see the sin there.
Because there's millions of trucks on the road which you could decarbonise very easily, which is a much smaller supply chain.
Okay, so our perspective on thank you.
Etc.
So our perspective on that is
It's looking at the broader perspective rather than just one industry.
right. We are looking at a broader perspective in the sense that it's looking to us. It may not be apparent on the road today, but people are saying that in a very few years, in advanced economies, OECD economies, for example, probably UAE also, all the new passenger vehicles manufactured will be electric. And from a renewable energy agency perspective, we imagine that the electricity mix will become increasingly renewable over time, and so that this will be largely handled. Now, we're not naive. This is not going to happen instantly. It will take a couple of decades, even where it starts soonest. In other places with weaker electric grids, they may start much later. And other places like Brazil, where you have a system going with ethanol fuels, they may see no need to go electric. But the point is that we sort of think we need to focus most on the sectors that are hardest to electrify, which to some extent are the heavy end of the freight spectrum and the marine spectrum, and passenger aviation. Now, even apparently, if you are able to get 2 or 3 orders of magnitude improvement, further improvement in storage technologies, people are in the airline industry, aircraft manufacturers are saying that by the 2040s, you might be able to do very short passenger flights on fully electric planes. But nobody imagines that you're going to be flying from Washington, D.C. To Abu Dhabi on an electric plane anytime soon, if ever at all. So in that sense, we do feel actually focusing on biofuel for the jet sector makes sense.
I'd like to pile on one of the things that Jennifer brought up, which is the distributed production. It's one of the interesting things I discovered a few years ago is that Australia no longer has the whole continent of Australia. There's not a refinery that makes jet fuel anymore. They closed the last one, and they import all 100% of their jet product. And as a prior military officer, I find that scary, frankly. I know there's a lot of work in the U.S. on district power, distributed generation, microgrids, things like that. And I see this as almost a similar vein where if you do have the ability, you can think of it not just for a place like Australia, but island economics, or you mentioned parts of Africa, things like that, where you could aggregate feedstocks and then produce fuel that can be used for road use or aviation use. Locally, it would be good for the local economy as well as provide that, if you will, some forms of energy security, local energy security to those areas. So I do think that's something else that is worth considering. Anyone else? Any other questions? All right, I have more. One of the things, Jennifer, to come back to you. It was noted yesterday, opening session, that the average price of Brent crude has risen from $53 to $70 a barrel over the past year. But that, even at those numbers, oil is still relatively inexpensive. Please speak to the challenges that these new technologies face when trying to break into these competitive and well-established markets. How do biofuel producers, in general, achieve financial sustainability, which is one of those, I call it kind of the 4th pillar of sustainability there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've been refining petroleum for over 100 years, right? And you take a technology like, say, FCC, and you optimize it. It's being optimized since the 40s, right? And every next generation drives the cost curve down. And the problem with biofuels, especially next generation biofuels or any other new technology, is the first ones are always more expensive. If you design it so that it's going to work, you add a lot of fat. I could probably take, by the 3rd or 4th unit that I build of our technology, 20% off the capital easily and really improve the operating costs. So it's really, it's not the, I agree with you, 80% of the cost of all process technologies is feedstock, but the other piece is just how expensive putting steel in the ground is when it's the first of a kind. And you learn, you get better, and you have to just bet on that. And this is actually why, the way I view the aviation sector, it's a sector that has been investing to bring the first of a kind to market, and by doing so, they're helping to drive the cost down. The first ones will be more expensive, but after those first investments, we won't need the airlines to participate. The costs will have come down. So my view is that that's the part, it's not the price of petroleum that kills you, it's the cost of capital combined with the price of petroleum and the efficiency improvements that you don't have in your first of a kinds.
Great. Linden, in general, sustainable aviation fuels are only available in small quantities and typically at higher price points than petroleum alternatives, as we just discussed. Could you explain to the audience why Etihad considers these fuels an important part of its liquid energy mix? And where I really want to go with this is there customer demand for sustainability? Can you speak to what your customers want?
Yeah. I think it's worth kind of reiterating what Jen said about this kind of the whole pricing issue, because at the moment it absolutely is more expensive for airlines who choose to get into the fuels now, but they're doing it because we know, going past that point, we have to, at some point in the future, we have a huge potential financial liability through CORSIA, potentially other taxes, charges, even though we developed CORSIA with the view that it would then be the one and only system that the industry would have. We can't guarantee that will be the fact. So in terms of why not just we're doing it, but many airlines are involved in it, is simply to reduce that kind of financial liability in the future. Some airlines are making a choice to look at investment now in facilities. Some of them are going into off-take agreements, and how they price that may well be partly they know there's part of it will just have to take a hit because in the long term it will be better for them. Knowing that CORSIA is coming in. In terms of our demands on the customers, I'd say it was less of an issue than this CORSIA financial risk into the future, this whole drive to decarbonise. But there is one sector of our customers that I think, not necessarily driving it, but we're very aware of, and that's our cargo customers. Now, passengers are individuals. Okay, we have corporate contracts with some big organisations, big companies who have to do a lot of flying as part of the contract. But it's really the cargo guys, and that is driven by their customers. They're big organisations who themselves have got strict, and they've set targets. They've put targets in place. Some of these big companies who have to ship their goods all over the world, and if it's time dependent, then it goes on air cargo. And they are driving that requirement down to us. So we are getting a lot of very detailed questionnaires and requirements through our big carbon customers. Again, whether this will actually end up driving our investment or purchasing of alternative fuels, but it's something that we have to be very cognizant of, is these demands, and these demands could go up in time. I mean, the requirements of these customers could be at a point where it could start influencing our decision making.
Yes, another area we're seeing that, and I didn't touch on the paper because there was just, you had to set some limits. But another area we're seeing that in the U.S. is around business aviation, actually, where a lot of big corporations that have aircraft are seeking biofuels, or they want to be able to say to their customers that their executives or whatever the transportation they're using is using biofuels. So we're seeing. I know World Energy has been supplying Gulfstream. So it's not just the large airlines or cargo operations. It's actually leaking on into some of those other areas. And the price point of Jet A at a lot of the smaller airports actually would support, could potentially support more. Once again, I'll ask anyone out here. Go ahead.
I just want to follow up with what Linden mentioned, the efforts on municipal solid waste, and just wanted to see, I think that was announced last October, just to see how that's progressing, and then if there's any kind of milestones that you see, like a report out or some future goals that might come from that effort. It sounds like, I think it was like 700,000 tons of waste locally that's looking to be diverted, and I think that would kind of probably put it in the 10 to 20 million gallon range potentially per year. I'm not sure if that's, I'm doing some table math here.
Yeah,
so
I think the last time I spoke to Tadweer, they were talking 30 plus million litres, 38 million
So that's
litres.
about the
Yeah.
10
Is that right?
million
Yeah,
Oh,
gallons.
okay,
okay.
okay. I know.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks for doing the
Thank
conversion.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we signed an MoU, so there's no at this stage, for Etihad, it's purely really providing the support. I think really because of the fact that we started this discussion with them. So yes, I mean, we were really pleased that Tadweer said that they wanted to engage in this. So at the moment, what they're doing now is they've engaged a consultant and they're looking at options. So they're basically looking at all the technology providers. In terms of a timeline, that's not something that they've actually pinned down now, but I'd like to think that in the next year or so that will be commissioned, it will be designed. We're talking, I don't know, Jennifer maybe knows what sort of timelines those types of things take, maybe in the next 5 years. That does kind of lead me on to talking about how, like these things take time. Like we've been involved in this Sustainable Bioenergy Research Consortium for the project that we're working with Khalifa University and Boeing and others. It's taken time, but it comes back to that point about getting it right. I mean, I don't want them to rush and say we're going to have something in 2 years if it's not going to work. What's 5 years in terms of the fact that all that waste is currently going into a landfill and it's been doing that for the last 20 years? Wouldn't it be great to think in 5 years we'd have the perfect solution, not rather than a compromise in 3 years? I mean, I think it is so important to get these projects right. So let's just hope, watch this space, and let's hope that, maybe in 5 years I'll be invited back to talk about that project.
I do think I think it is interesting because there are many different technologies. Because when you talk about using like MSW, which is being done, that does use Fischer tropes usually for those conversions, or the biomass from the Khalifa University project. They would have the mangrove biomass would need to be converted in some manner. You actually would end up with multiple conversion technologies, right? From a lot of these streams. I mean, there's not going to be one answer. There's going to be there's potential here for many winners. And then when you have a project like the one that Khalifa University is working on, you also, as you mentioned, you have the food production. That's really the driver of that project. Project is the food production, and the biofuels or whatever you do there is an answer to the waste stream issue of the food production. So it's once again, it can be win-win-win in a lot of these cases. Well, I'll do one last question here, and Jennifer, I'll direct this at you. Looking at this from a customer standpoint for a producer, large potential offtake takers like Etihad Airlines or other airlines. How can they best support your efforts to scale? Is it simply just being a good customer? And if so, kind of describe what that is to you. Or do you need them to be investors? I mean, is it offtake agreements? Or is it an investment? Is really the question.
You actually need to do multiple things. So when we talk about, let's distinguish between the first plants and then later. Okay, so in the first plants, there's actually no established sustainable aviation fuel market. There's no established price. Doesn't get traded. There's all of these issues, right? So you end up have to have an offtake agreement. The offtake agreement, if you want a loan for a new technology, needs to match the time period of the loan, right? So instead of a 2-year offtake agreement, you tend to have at least 5 years, if not 10 years. Otherwise, you'll never get the debt to build that plant. So offtake agreements can't look like a typical purchasing agreement to be successful in helping a new technology get out the door. The second thing that's important is, I don't know that necessarily investment is required. I think good offtake agreements and some amount of either investment or pre-purchase, I've seen pre-purchases as well, will help get the first few gallons out. After you do that, then it should become a tradable commodity like everything else, and you don't need all of this convincing of the equity partners and the debt partners that somebody will actually buy this, especially if prices fluctuate. Imagine if now we get shale goes crazy, right, and you get $30 a barrel petroleum. And don't think that's an impossible thing. It could happen, right? And then will somebody continue to buy this biofuel? That's why you need the long-term offtake agreements with the right pricing structure. Convince the banks.
Well, I'll ask one last time. Any last words from the audience? Well, thank you everyone for participating today. Really appreciate everyone attending, and let's pay off our guests here with a round of applause. Thank you.